live thing on your screen there?
Well, can you check the got it? Or I should get it from there, right?
It looks like it's going live from this end.
All set.
I haven't noticed that it's
Just saw that message go by. Okay. So good morning. Today is Friday, January 12th, 2024. It's 9 a.m. And this is a meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We are continuing our work on S213 and act relating to the regulation of wetlands, river corridor development, and dam safety. Yesterday, and our focus this week has really been almost been like going to school. We've been focusing on the science first and then turning to the provisions in the bill second. And next week, we'll be working much more closely with the bill itself, and we'll have ANR leadership in to give us sort of an administration take on this bill as introduced. So that I'd like to thank our guests who are here today and check in with our three guests. So we have roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes. And I didn't have a chance to connect with Ms. LaPierre, Mr. Duane, and Mr. Green. Can you just say approximately how much time you think you would need to share with us what you would like to share this morning, so we can make sure our timing works out for everybody? Ms. LaPierre, you're going to be up first. What's the right amount of time for you?
I can keep the presentation to a half hour.
Okay, so let's aim for half an hour. I'm sure there'll be some committee questions. Mr. Duane, how about you?
Same here, Senator Bray. I can keep my remarks to whatever the committee needs, but I think a half hour, just like Laura, would be great.
Okay, thanks. And Mr. Green, good to see you again. Half an hour, the right size for you, or should we plan on more?
My presentation is probably a hair more, but I can move a little quicker, move through some slides more quickly if half an hour is desired.
All right, well, that's we should be good then, because I think we have dedicated the morning just working with the three of you. So okay, with that, let's get started. Ms. LaPierre, the floor is yours. And I don't know if you have a PowerPoint, and we're all set. Okay.
Yep, I do. Good morning, everybody. For the record, my name is Laura LaPierre. I am the Wetlands Program Manager of the Wetlands Program within the Watershed Management Division, Department of Environmental Conservation, Agency of Natural Resources. Thank you for having me today. I'm going to speak about our state wetlands program, what we do from outreach to compliance and compensation and such. I have 5 slides, which I believe you have as a handout. And primarily I have lots of notes in there.
Sorry,
so you have the information.
Ms. LaPierre, they don't have the handout. It's on our website. Okay. So you need to, I gave you permission to share your screen. If you could share your screen, we'll be all set.
Yep, certainly. I was going to introduce before pulling that up. And I'll do that now.
You know, in general, just for all our presenters today, I'm figuring we're sort of science oriented. But if you want to also, you know, include comments on how the bill does or does not address things, you know, we will come again. We're going to be focusing more on bill language next week, but feel free to be sharing information related to the bill itself too.
Yep, certainly. And you can see my screen now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so as introduction, wetlands are where land and water meet, commonly called swamps, bogs, marshes. They're really not dry land, not deep water habitats. So a place in between, which makes them unique. And all of the water pooling in those areas creates really unique circumstances for certain species to grow and reproduce. And so there's a lot of biodiversity within wetlands, and also some really unique characteristics that make it important for water quality protection, water control, erosion control, and such. I have some statistics up here about how much a small portion of the state provides for different flood storage, aesthetics, and habitat for the state of Vermont and nationally.
And sorry, quick question. Oh, here we go. My question's on slide 2.
Okay,
Slide 2. Thank you.
great. Yep, so we lost many wetlands before there were protections. They were seen as wastelands. Now people understand their value when we have state and federal protections. In some cases, there are some towns that have protections. The state and federal protections are completely separate from one another, but we do certainly work together. Before 1980, it's estimated that we lost around 35% of our wetlands in the state of Vermont, which is better than the national average, which is about 50%. So today, about 4% of the state is considered wetland area, and we are protecting those and their buffer zones as well. For some information from our program, between 2016 and 2020, our permit work resulted in a net gain of 18.5 acres. That is just the tracking of our permit work. So what people were proposing for impacts versus what they were proposing for restoration and enhancements to wetlands. In just last year, to give you a more recent statistic, our permitting projects resulted in 2.5 acres of wetland fill, but 5.2 acres of enhancement and restoration. We have these statistics because we're required from EPA, because we get funding from them to report out on this information. So we have specific annual reports that we do, and then we have more comprehensive 5-year reports. Besides permitting, we do wetland health assessment. We call that biomonitoring. And we take part in a national assessment every 5 years. And the last report from that work was found that nationally 47% of our wetlands are in good condition and over a third in poor condition. For the state of Vermont, we're still working on increasing our data. So we don't have specific percentages for the state of Vermont yet, but in general, we have a higher frequency of good condition wetlands in the Northeast Kingdom and the Green Mountains, where there are less people. And so there's less alterations to those wetlands, and more alterations happening more in valley bottoms, as you can imagine. The EPA national report and our studies have found that some of the leading problems for our remaining wetlands, because they're the lost wetlands, are lost wetlands. We don't have data on those other than losses and gains. But the leading problems with the wetlands that we have today are problems with soil hardening, vegetation removal, ditching, causing some draining, and non-native plants growing within these wetlands. And Senator Bray, you said you had a question on this slide?
Sure, thank you. So the 35% loss, does that mean that the 4% that we have now once was more like 6%? We've lost about a third? Is that what we're saying there?
Yeah, so it's not 4% of our wetlands are remaining, but 4% of the area of the state today is
Yeah.
wetland.
Is wetland. And, okay, and then do you know how, I'm trying to think about that in acres, a little bit instead of percentages. And do you happen to know how that, we can do that, I can do the math offline, I don't know if you know off the top of your head. Yeah, that means we've lost 200,000 acres, or who knows, but.
It's between 3,000 and 4,000 acres.
Yeah, 200,000 acres, okay, thank you.
Okay, so diving in on how we protect wetlands in the state. One of the first steps is finding the wetlands, and it's more complicated than you would think, because wetlands are a gradual transition sometimes from deep water to dry land. You have to be a soil scientist, a botanist, and understand hydrology. So we look at these three parameters: whether the site has wet soil, water-loving plants like the cinnamon fern here in the picture, and then signs of water, which may be pooling water, or it may just be signs that there was water there at one point, such as water-stained leaves. This year was a lot easier year to be finding our wetlands because there was so much water on the landscape. But the previous couple of years, we had drought conditions in the middle of the summer. So this made it more difficult in those wetlands that were only seeing saturation during the springtime. They're still wetlands. You only need water within 12 inches of the soil surface for 14 days out of the growing season. So there's a lot of diversity in wetlands, as you can imagine, a ponded wetland being very different from a wetland that's only saturated for 14 days. But that's what we have. We can see a lot of signs of water and water-loving plants when we're looking at aerial imagery. That gives us a good sense of it, but you really need boots on the ground to find the precise boundary. So when we do our mapping, we're looking for those signs of water, water-loving plants. We also have information about wetland soils in soil maps. But when it comes down to it, you do need to go onto the site to find that precise information. And then from that boundary, the state protects a 50-foot buffer zone. So any activities occurring within the protected wetland or within 50 feet of that wetland is needs to come in for a permit unless the activity is listed out as an allowed use. We don't protect all wetlands in the state. The charge that we have in statute is that we protect significant wetlands that provide the functions and values that you saw on my earlier slide. So we have classified our wetlands 1, 2, and 3, where class 1 wetlands are exceptional in function and value, irreplaceable, and those are protected to the point where you can only get a permit to impact within the wetland if you have a compelling need for public health and safety. That's it. Those need to go through a rule change in order to be designated as class 1. Class 2 wetlands are the majority of our wetlands in the state. They are significant for one or more functions and values. They have the 50-foot buffer zone. Class 1 wetlands by default have a 100-foot buffer zone, but some of them have as much as a 400-foot buffer zone, and that's to protect the functions and values of those wetlands. And then class 3 wetlands are not regulated by the state. We've increased the number of projects that we've reviewed and permits in the past couple of years. It used to be around over 100, now it's over 200. Used to be around 600 projects a year. Now we're over 1,000 projects a year that we're looking at. We're only giving people permits when the activity cannot be placed elsewhere and the functions and values are not adversely affected. If they are adversely affected and they really need to do the project, then we go forward with mitigation of restoring wetlands elsewhere or on site.
Okay. When you say projects, can you just say what sort of the range of things that project, I mean, is this
Yes,
housing or development, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so this is any activity in a wetland or buffer zone. So this can be an individual landowner looking to put in a driveway versus Vermont Gas wanting to make a 40-mile gas pipeline through Edison County. So they vary quite a bit, and we work with individuals as well as corporations.
Thank you.
So here's one of my more dense slides, but there's just so much going on with mapping. I'm really excited about this work because wetland management means we need to have a good inventory. You can imagine if you're a chicken farmer, you need to know how many roosters you have, how many lambs you have. In wetlands, we need to know how many bugs we have, fens, how are they doing on the landscape and such. And we have funding to do a statewide update and have contracts in place with a nationally known group who have done wetland mapping throughout the country. And that statewide update will be completed in 2026. So we're really excited about that. The image that you're seeing here of the map is off of Route 2 in Plainfield. You can see that the current national wetlands inventory only shows a couple of areas considered as wetland, but with the improvements, technology and such, there's a lot more wetlands that can be found today. So to show you that comparison, we're really adding a lot of value to the program by having this additional mapping. This is also really good for people who want to do projects in the state. So they are able to plan to stay away from those wetland areas. This is only a planning tool. They still need to have boots on the ground for determining the exact location, but this is leaps and bounds better than what we have right now. We also add wetlands to the map as people come in for permits. So what may not be able to be detected on aerial interpretation, we can add from consultants giving us their information and us adding it to the maps. We've really sped that up from doing a little over 300 in 4 years, adding 300 wetlands, to having nearly 400 wetlands that are about to be added early this year. So that's really exciting. I have the different types of mapping that we have, and the National Wetlands Inventory is where the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory started from. We need to meet the National Wetlands Inventory standards in order to use EPA funds to do the mapping. The consultant is meeting that standard. Then we are filtering which wetlands are considered significant, and we are adding them onto the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory, which is shows where regulated wetlands are, and really right now misses a lot of those wetlands. So we're excited to have that added. The Missisquoi River Basin has been updated for the significant wetlands inventory, so you can check that out. That was updated in February, and we are doing some functional assessments of those areas, so we have information on which wetlands may be really important for carbon sequestration, and flood storage, both relating to resilience. So other things we might be doing with the mapping is targeting where to do wetland restoration, helping realtors screen for wetlands when people are purchasing property, so they know if the whole thing is wetland or if there's space for housing and such.
The, quick question on that last one. So the boots on the ground version, validation of things, is that what people also refer to as, like, wetlands delineation?
Yes.
Okay, and if someone, doesn't, is an assessment of whether or not wetlands are present a requirement as part of development? Because if you did know that something was, I don't know, a class 3 wetland, because you didn't go looking for it, then, I'm just trying to figure out, do you have to ask everyone who's developing something to have a survey for, to do a delineation for the presence of wetland? So that people don't unknowingly just blow right by and not ask for a permit because they didn't know that they even needed.
Correct. That's a requirement whenever you're doing some digging, some filling, grading operations, removing vegetation other than silviculture. Those are all activities that you need to know if you're within wetland or buffer zone. There's a false sense by some people that they can look on the map and say, there's no wetland there, I'm good, even though I'm sinking up to my ankles. That's really some of the messaging that we're really trying to get out. We have a good outreach campaign that's going to be starting this summer to help with that education, along with some of our map improvements that are going to become publicly available. So yeah, it's really, if you're developing, doing earthwork, you should be hiring a consultant to get wetland boundary information. If you're a landowner, you could call up one of our district ecologists who can go out onto the site and look for wetlands for you to see if you do need that cost of getting a delineator. Having better wetland maps, though, will help people plan on by having some sense of the extent of wetlands on a property.
And in terms of a requirement to look, I'm guessing that it probably comes up if you're going through Act 250, looking at soils for wetlands. I don't know not remembering off the top of my head if that's a specific requirement, but are there other permits? Are there other processes for reviewing development that also have a required assessment of whether or not a wetland is present?
Yep. So yep. Certainly, Act 250 has 1G where you have to have a finding about wetlands, and then there's the Public Utility Commission where you need to have no harm to the environment. For everything else, I mean, with grant applications. With our water quality grants, there is language in the guidance documents that points people to looking for wetlands, because we certainly don't want a water quality improvement project to then be impacting wetlands and degrading water quality and doing, both of those things. So we review a lot of those projects. We do a lot of education for realtors and developers and consultants. But going through certain municipalities, they'll point to our wetland regulations asking for wetland review, but not in all cases where you would need a permit because you're doing an activity in wetland, would there be another jurisdiction that would advise someone to do that? And so that's where we're really always looking for opportunities to do outreach about this important requirement.
Thank you.
These for you. I think they are. I don't know who they're for, but they're for this room.
Oh, this room. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. All set here again.
What'd you get? What was that?
We just got a delivery of candles.
Hard copy for the presentation.
Thank you.
It'll be waiting on your desk.
Okay.
Great. So going on to my last slide here, wetland mitigation, wetland voluntary restoration are both important tools for managing our state wetlands. But our program is primarily focused on that outreach and getting people to avoid the resource entirely. You don't have to pay for a permit, you don't have to pay for mitigation if you just stay away from those areas. After folks are finding that their project can't avoid, we're looking to minimize the impacts as much as possible. So restoring if you need to dig a trench for a pipeline and then fill it back in, making sure good vegetation is growing back in and it's wetland again, for example. We also look for on-site enhancements where if you're impacting the wetland over here for a driveway, you can stop mowing the wetland over here and allow it to grow up and provide more functions and values on that exact site. In the end, we still have some circumstances where there is harm to wetland function and value when a project has avoided and minimizes to the greatest extent practicable, and we end up looking for compensation. So there are a couple of ways you can do compensation in the state. You can do on-site, create your own compensation, do your own restoration project, or you can pay into the in-lieu fee program. So doing your own compensation plan means you need to ensure several things that are listed in the rules. There must be no net loss. You have to monitor the site to make sure it's successful. It has to be self-sustaining in the long run, have permanent protection, and you need to have adequate finances to make that happen. You also have to do that work before or during your impact project as well. This requires a lot of hand-holding. There's risk of the site not being successful when you're working with people who aren't familiar with doing wetland restoration. A study in Massachusetts has found that only a third of those replacement projects have actually been successful, which is really low, really low. The benefits of doing this type is you end up with wetland replacement restoration within the same community where wetland was harmed. So you're still getting that local functions and values staying in place. When you're looking at the federal in-lieu fee program, which is a way people can pay for a third party, in Vermont, it's Ducks Unlimited, for them to restore wetlands on the landscape. That just needs to happen within the larger watershed. So you can have a project take place in South Burlington, and the restoration would end up along the Otter Creek by Rutland, for example. These projects are, done by professionals. They're larger areas, so it's a bit easier to get long-term funding, a conservation entity on board to protect it in perpetuity and things like that. So there's cost benefits of both techniques that you can take. The in lieu fee program is it's expensive, but I'd say, you know, making your own compensation plan is also expensive and might be a little bit more of an unknown because you're responsible if the site fails, whereas Ducks Unlimited will make sure it doesn't fail in the in lieu fee situation. The amount of restoration or credits that needs to take place because of the impacts for a project. It's based on acreage, impact type, and we use the federal guidance. This is a clickable link if you're interested in seeing those tables and learning more about that. But in some instances, we might require a 1-to-1 ratio. For every square foot of wetland impacted, you have a square foot that needs to be restored. But then we also have some percentages where you can imagine, you know, a forested wetland knocked back to a non-woody wetland, a marsh, harms less functions and values than if you were to fill it entirely. So that's where we might only ask for compensation for 30% so that there is wetland elsewhere, but understanding that the wetland on that site is still remaining. I'm just trying to think if there's a bit more to that. There's so much to this.
Yeah. I have a
Compensation piece. Yes.
a question about this 3 Mile Bridge Road project, 138 acres, 58 of wetland restored. So does Ducks Unlimited sort of bank 58 acres of restored wetland, and they could split that, you know, 29 over 2 other projects, that it was an offsetting or is.
Yep. So what happens? I'll speak more to the process and give you more details about the specific sites because it's always good to have examples. So when someone pays into the in lieu fee fund, it goes into the federal tracking program called RIBETS, which is an adorable name for an acronym that has to do with, you know, regulatory banking and compensation funds. And they track where the project came from, what functions and values were harmed, and what wetland types were impacted. Was it forested, emergent marsh, etc.? And then Ducks Unlimited is charged with finding a site that they can purchase from a landowner and restoring for those types of functions and wetland types. So they don't have the restoration sites. When we first started this program in 2011, there were no restoration sites yet. That's different from a banking system, which we don't have in Vermont. That is another technique of having an entity build wetlands and get back paid for it. In this system, we're getting the funds for credits, and then Ducks Unlimited is finding sites where they can restore to the functions and cover types. And for example, this 3 Mile Bridge site in Middlebury, this image, it was a cornfield in 2017, 2018. There was a lot of credits built up within the larger Richelieu service area, which is basically the Lake Champlain Basin. So they found this large site that is a bit bigger than what the credits were that were in place at the time. So they're doing like a little bit of finding sites that have more restoration potential so they can do more restoration as more funds come in. And this site has forested wetland, emergent wetland. They plugged a bunch of ditches. So, for example, when the floods came in July, the water stayed on the land and wetland for longer than it was when it was just draining right back into the Middlebury River and Otter Creek. So it's difficult to entirely turn a site into 100% wetland. So that's where I have, this is a 138 acre site and 58 acres were appropriate to be wetland. Again, remember, it's important to have good buffers to those wetlands. And that's what having this larger parcel is doing, is this is more land, more of a buffer between the wetland and development so that it can have and perform greater function and value. This is a great site because you can drive right by it and see how it's working. And with any of these projects, you need a long-term landowner, and Fish and Wildlife now is the owner of this project, which is really great to have a long-term steward within A&R here. Besides this restoration that's mandated from permitting, we're also really incentivizing and encouraging voluntary restoration, where we host a wetlands roundtable where different wetland restoration entities all get together and compare notes, past projects around. This landowner may be willing to do a wetland restoration site. It doesn't meet this nonprofit's needs, so maybe they can talk with another nonprofit or state entity and get a good match and restore the site for their specific goals. It all requires landowners being volunteering their land. They do get compensation for it, and the RCPP project is one great example. We partner with the Natural Resources Conservation Services, who does some excellent wetland restoration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And sometimes the amount that they're able to pay isn't enough for a landowner to say yes to a project. So with this regional conservation partnership program, we were able to bring in additional federal funds for more wetland restoration. We've been doing this since 2015 and have funding out to 2029 to do this work, for the state to specify what sort of projects we're looking for, and also give landowners an incentive payment above the listed price of the land, so that they say, yes, I definitely want to do this project. They're able to make some money off of it, and then we're able to restore and really key places within the state. Primarily, our focus is on finding places that would attenuate phosphorus for Lake Champlain cleanup. This project has restored 186 acres, and like I said, we have funding to continue this through 2029. With this project, we also worked on a map of areas within the Lake Champlain Basin that were good for restoration potential. With our updated mapping that we're working on, we'll be able to update this restoration model so that it is more successful in identifying and pinpointing priority areas for wetland restoration.
Okay, we have a question from Senator Watts.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm wondering what your what the biggest bottleneck is for these projects, right? Like, I'm glad to hear that you have funding through 2029. you know, if you had, maybe this is an obvious question, but maybe the answer is no, I don't know, like, if you had more money, could you do more projects? Or is the bottleneck more like, we kind of have a hard time finding appropriate sites, and, you know, if you had more willing landowners, like, that's the bottleneck, like, what would be the most useful thing for you?
I think that Will works more closely with finding sites, so he can speak to this in more depth. But I'll say that the bottleneck has kind of waffled between finding willing landowners to then having all these sites where someone needs to come up with a restoration plan and implement the restoration. So in years that the economy makes these types of programs more enticing for landowners, we're able to purchase those easements or purchase the land to have it ready to do restoration on. And then if we have a bunch of those, then someone needs to come up with the restoration plans. So those are two areas. Another area
Like,
recently
before
was,
you go on, I'm sorry, I wanna make sure I'm clear on that, so I understand the, like, the one thing being finding sites, but the other thing is that, like, the lack of engineers or people or planners to, like, come up with a plan for the site?
yes.
Okay, okay,
Yep, there aren't a lot of people who do restoration plans in the state. We have some folks who are really good at it, and there has been some trainings recently to help up that number. But so it might be less of an issue than it was in the past, but it has been an issue before. And then another piece that's being worked on is just having enough plant material for planting these sites. Sometimes we have so much restoration going on in plantings that there's a bit of a shortage by the end of the season.
okay, thank you, yeah.
You're welcome.
One quick land sort of disposition question. So the state is the actual owner of the land, you purchase it from the current owner, and then was a little unclear, like what the Ducks Unlimited role is. Do they hold an easement that requires them to maintain, how does that work?
Yep, so Ducks Unlimited purchases the land and looks for a long-term landholder for the project. They're not interested in necessarily owning the land into perpetuity, so they're looking for partners to take the projects once they're restored. And in this case of 3 Mile Bridge, Vermont Fish and Wildlife has stepped up and is taking on the long-term stewardship of this site. The NRCS wetland restoration program is an easement program, so the original landowner still owns the land in those cases. And a lot of folks who are interested in that are, interested in doing more hunting on that site maybe, or looking to get some retirement fund and things like that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I will take off my presentation and speak a bit to the bill. I really see it as a three-parter. We have mapping, reporting, and then permitting, which is primarily net gain and compensation. The mapping that's within the bill is really similar to the work that we're doing. And there's some things in there that changes that might help make it easier for the administration long term. I won't speak on the specifics today, just to give you a general overview. The reporting is very similar to what we're doing. today, but there are some items that are being asked for us to report on that we don't currently report on today. So there would need to be some IT resources and reworking within the program to make those reporting requirements accomplished. We have recently been showing net gain within our program. Sometimes that requires compensation. I'm not entirely clear on the bill whether it's looking for compensation at a 2-to-1 for just wetland fill type activities, or specifically when there's a finding of an adverse effect on functions and values. So those are some areas for discussion at another time.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Watson.
Yeah, so on that point with, this future discussion, just thinking about, with the reporting, if there's a need for IT resources, it'd be good to know what you need, like. Whether if that's just money or if it's programs or software or whatever, like, it'd just be good to know.
Yep, certainly. We can discuss that more and come with more information at another time.
Cool.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions for Ms. LaPierre before we go to Mr. Dwayne? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Mr. Dwayne, the floor is yours.
Good morning, members. For the
Morning.
record, my name is Will Dwayne. I'm the Land Acquisition Coordinator for the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm a little rusty on Zoom here, so give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen. Jude's given me the appropriate permissions here, but I'll find a way to do it incorrectly. Sorry to hear some of the members are under the weather. You have my sympathies. I have tested positive for COVID myself for the first time this week, so it's a good time.
We look very healthy for someone who's been through that, so.
Appreciate that.
You're not very well.
Are you able to see my presentation?
Yes, thank you.
So as I said, I'm the Land Acquisition Coordinator for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I work in the Wildlife Division and up at our offices at National Life right there in Montpelier. I just wanted to talk to you today about what the department and the agency are working on already in this space, in the flood resiliency space. You're hearing a lot from our scientists and engineers this week. I want to continue that theme of wetlands education, but I'm going to veer a little away from natural processes and focus on state government processes. And this is where I get to take the good science from all of our amazing staff at the agency and apply it to our conservation efforts. I'm speaking specifically about Vermont conservation design and all the wetland and river corridor information you've been hearing. I'm not a biologist or an engineer myself, but it's a privilege to work with all the dedicated and expert staff we have at the agency. I'm going to cover the reasons why we acquire some of the parcels that we do. I'll run through some recent and current acquisition projects, and we'll finish up by talking about funding. And please do jump in at any point. I got multiple screens here and might not see any hands or anything like that. The Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. We own over 150 properties statewide. We might not be as high profile as the state parks or the state forests, but if you look closely, you'll see our wildlife management areas and our stream bank management parcels. We've been doing this type of work for over 100 years. This is public land that we steward and hold open for the people of Vermont, and at last count, it's approaching 130,000 acres. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is the largest single owner of wetlands in the state of Vermont, next closest being the Green Mountain National Forest. And the reasons we do this work is for wildlife habitat and public access, but increasingly this work is in favor of water quality and flood resiliency. Some of the science that we use, I mentioned, we focus on Vermont conservation design as kind of our guidepost. Surface waters and wetlands are all highest priority under Vermont conservation design. In this past summer, the flooding, we were able to confirm, and I'll run through some of the projects here in a moment, but our properties, specifically up and down the Otter Creek, took on water during these summer floods. They did exactly what they were supposed to do and what they wanted to do in their natural states. Through drone reconnaissance and site visits in the days after the floods, even after the rain stopped, our properties were still taking water out of the river, which we feel very happy about. The hard work and the planning did what it was supposed to.
Will, I have a quick question. Were you on that trip this summer with?
Yes, sir.
Before, I thought so.
We will, I'll highlight one of those properties here in just a moment. So some of these conservation efforts that we do, they include acquisitions in fee, full acquisitions of properties. And in this space, we're talking primarily about our wetland and floodplain acquisition efforts. We also restore wetlands that we've acquired. We reinforce and manage stream bank properties throughout the state. We provide assessments and technical assistance for municipalities, and through a series of granting out funds, we help partners realize their goals through our state wildlife grants, the habitat stamp grants that we do, and watershed grants. Those specifically go toward replacing undersized culverts and removing dams in some instances. And then finally, wood additions to streams. Our fish division scientists like to say that fish grow on trees, and for trout habitat, that is 100% true. We have found that those biological fish habitat wood additions also help with flood resiliency. And we'll get into that detail a little bit later. In addition to some of the funding that we have access to ourselves, we rely on tons of outside partners. These might be stakeholders and non-government groups that folks on the committee are familiar with. The NGOs in this space like Trust for Public Land, Vermont Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy, Vermont Rivers Conservancy, the Conservation Fund, and then state entities like VHCB, AAFM, DEC, folks like Laura and her program, and then our federal partners like US EPA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, and US Forest Service. So for project leads and for funding opportunities, I assure you no stone is unturned in our conservation efforts. Going just directly into some of our projects here, this might be one of the most relevant and high profile ones related to flood resiliency. What we're looking at on the screen is a map of our Brandon Swamp Wildlife Management Area. The town of Brandon, just off to the east in this photo, you can see Route 7 in red. What you see in that darker color, that sort of khaki on the map, is the current footprint of our Brandon Swamp Wildlife Management Area. What's in blue are properties that we've added in the last month and or are hoping to acquire within the next 12 months. The WMA is currently 600 acres. It's public land. We've got a growing footprint there, and this is excellent habitat for ducks, mammals as well, but it is a prime waterfowl birding and hunting area. These swamps along the Otter Creek are, there's 7 named swamp complexes, and they are among the most biodiverse swamp complexes, all in the New England and New York region. They feature unique swamp forest types, and really it's their connectivity and the wetland functions that we put such high value in. Just south of here is our Pomainville Wildlife Management Area. I was trying to embed a video here, but we've got some pretty stunning drone photography of what those looked like when they were underwater. And Senator Bray, I believe that was the first stop on our site visit this summer.
Yeah.
But right here, what we're looking at on the map, this is a concentrated effort by the department to conserve and improve these wetlands along the Otter Creek. The Otter Creek is our longest river in Vermont, and it seems like evenly spaced throughout it. We have historic downtowns just downstream from these large swamp complexes. So it's water quality, it's wildlife habitat, it's public access, but with these weather events we're having, it's increasingly floodwater storage. Again, on the Otter Creek, I want to talk about how we fund these things as well. This project right here and most of what you're seeing on the site were acquired through our Vermont Duck Stamp. It's state funding that the Department of Fish and Wildlife generates through sales of duck stamps. It's been an unqualified success story. And if the committee would have us back at a later date, we'd love to just talk about the history and the conservation success of the Vermont Duck Stamp. Most recently,
Sorry, quick question on what's the scale of the funds that come out of the duck stamp versus the habitat stamp?
Yeah, those two funds are actually pretty similar. We deposit the monies generated from those efforts into interest-bearing accounts. I think they're in the exact same things that my retirement is in. So it tracks the stock market pretty regularly. We don't touch the principal, but we slice off the interest. And up until COVID times, it was going like gangbusters. With the raising of rates and the slowdown in the economy, we got pretty low in the duck stamp fund, but it is rebounding, and we're excited about that. I'd say annually, under $100,000 from each of those, but tens of thousands of dollars annually for conservation.
Yeah, great. So follow offline. I think there's so many people who aren't in the hunting community that appreciate natural areas that I'd love to see us have more people participate through that habitat.
Oh, 100%. Let me put in a big plug for the non-game wildlife fund and the Vermont Habitat Stamp. Folks have the opportunity for their tax checkoff at tax time or to purchase a habitat stamp, and those monies pay unbelievable dividends. We typically use that to match federal funds. So honestly, we can say that every dollar that's put in there is pretty much tripled with funds from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, both for staff and for these conservation efforts. Right here is another project along the Otter Creek. This was a 350-acre addition to our Otter Creek Wildlife Management Area. This is the section you're seeing in yellow, currently under department ownership. It features about 100 acres of wetlands and floodplain and about 1.5 miles of the Otter Creek. Big highlight of this parcel was its east to west connectivity. You can go from the Taconics to the top of the Green Mountains there with conserved land. But for the purposes of today, you just can see that wetland complex in the yellow there. The historic downtown Wallingford is about 3 miles just north of here. So the floodwater storage and the water quality benefits, but primarily that floodwater storage is an immediate benefit for the communities downstream. This acquisition here, no duck stamp involved in this one. We got a grant from the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, one of our great partners whom we rely on. And we did some fundraising, some private fundraising through Trust for Public Land, and then a big grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we don't just stick to the Otter Creek. The project we're looking at right now is 78 acres of farmland up in Troy that we've recently purchased using a big grant that we have from the US EPA. US EPA through DEC provides us with funding to conserve and restore wetlands in the Lake Champlain Basin. So we're looking at a map of Troy, but that's the upper Missisquoi River right there. And after it goes north into Canada, it comes back south and west and empties into Lake Champlain. So the parcels here were a combination of farmland, as well as some town-owned FEMA buyout parcels. As Laura mentioned before, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is situated to be the ultimate landowner for some of these conservation projects where others cannot. We are in the business of acquiring and managing more property. And it's a benefit for the town as well. When these FEMA buyouts take place, the municipalities own the property. Most of the rights are stripped away and the towns are not generating any income tax. So we are a unique buyer in that we will pay some property taxes in the form of our pilot payment annually to the town. And we improve the properties. We're uniquely positioned to create a net benefit there. Oh, and then again, I'm just bringing another map onto the same page. We're currently working on 2 more flooding buyouts in the town of Morrisville. And these are directly related to this summer's floods. What you're looking at on the screen right here, the blue outline with the dot is the Cadies Falls Nursery that folks might be familiar with in Morristown. They suffered like their 400-year flood this past summer and have simply had enough. They're surrounded by Vermont Fish and Wildlife stream bank management parcels, so this felt like a good fit for us. We've working with the landowners. We're applying with Vermont through Vermont Emergency Management for a buyout. The department will basically restore the parcel back to its original state. You can see where it's right in the bend of the river there. Absent building a berm, there's really not much that can be done to stop the flooding on this property. So again, we're a unique buyer here that this is the type of thing we're interested in. Again, just wanted to highlight an example here in a population center of our conservation wetland restoration work here. This is at our Intervale Wildlife Management Area. It's a property formerly known as the Fitzgerald Farm, right in the area of what folks call Pine Island in Colchester, near the Mazza Farm. The whole site is a big, fat peninsula that just sticks out into the river. You can see that a big enough flood, that's going to be an oxbow, you know, in the glacial time span, that would eventually become an oxbow. The farmers were flooded year after year, and again, using that EPA wetland restoration grant, partnered again with Vermont Housing Conservation Board and using some of our duck stamp fund, we acquired this property. It's 124 acres and 100 of it are going to be restorable to wetlands. So we are creating wetlands as a part of this program. Just some pictures here of the Fitzgerald Farm. This is some of their spring and late summer flooding. And this is typical. And the farmers were telling us it was getting worse. So we'll do seeding at this place. The row crops are being phased out. We anticipate this being an amazing duck hunting and mammal hunting area. The deer are throughout this entire area. I think some of the farmers in the area might be happy the deer are on this parcel.
I would think there'd be a lot less manure entering the river.
Very much so, yeah. So the main purpose of this EPA wetland restoration grant we have, it was directly in response to the 2016 TMDL. So it's all about nutrient retention, stopping runoff into the Lake Champlain Basin. We've been able to target big parcels in, Addison County is kind of mostly where we spent our money, but up the reaches of the rivers, the Lamoille, the Winooski, the Missisquoi, and the Otter Creek. These are all eligible funding areas for this grant. Another example of the EPA wetland restoration grant. This one was in partnership with USDA NRCS. This is in addition to our Lemon Fair Wildlife Management Area, formerly the Cannell Farm. Senator Bray, this is where we had parked this past summer along West Street in Bridport, Cornwall, to look down into the Lemon Fair. The Lemon Fair is a very slow moving river in Western Vermont. The geography around it, it's like a bowl. Everything funnels down to the middle. And there's been agriculture in the area for a very long time. USDA NRCS applied a wetland reserve easement to this parcel. And this is kind of a unicorn, a holy grail for our program. All 100% of these acres are restorable to wetlands. It's been an amazing site to watch. We've been extremely effective in the acquisition of these sites. We now need to really focus on the restoration component. This one is the furthest along because we've been able to work with USDA and US Fish and Wildlife Service to really focus the restoration work. When you park on West Street in Cornwall there and look into the Lemon Fair Basin, you can see the natural depressions or the the man-made depressions made to mimic natural processes that have been put in place. They are full of amphibians and waterfowl. It's really exciting to see that type of work. And they're doing exactly what we want them to do.
The former chair of this committee, contributed land to, along the banks of the Lemon Fair, up in, Weybridge, north of there. I'm talking about Arthur Good, who was here quite a while ago, but he had a farm on the Lemon. And I think eventually said, this shouldn't be farmland anymore, or it'll be wetland.
Oh, I'm sorry, Senator, it cut out there. Did you have a question at the end?
No.
Oh, okay. I apologize. I'm working from home and internet is not robust. On the right-hand side there, in blue, you'll just see another wetland restoration project we are working on in the same area. So you can see a lot of these ag lands we're trying to convert back to their natural functions. And then just briefly, I wanted to show two examples of projects we're working at our Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area, or just one here actually. What you're looking at on the right is our wetland restoration layer on the Vermont A&R Atlas. It can show you hydric soils that, but for human involvement, would want to return to wetlands. So for our program for the EPA grant, we strive for at least 40% of the lands acquired to be restorable to wetlands. You can see that this parcel here is close to 100%. That everything in red within that polygon is what we're hoping to restore. So we're doing well on the program. As a whole, we're on track for about 75% of the acres restored. And then just moving to another part of the state, this is a quick snapshot of 6 projects we're working on up in the Johns River area, Lake Memphremagog to the west in that picture we're looking at on the screen. 6 planned acquisitions along the Johns River. We're going to be restoring riparian areas, wetlands, floodplains. It's going to be increased public access for sure and recreational opportunities, but this is all about nutrient runoff, retention, and water storage during flood events. And then finally, so that was just kind of a taste of the work we're doing. Just wanted to highlight some of the biggest funding sources specifically for this wetland type of work. The Vermont Duck Stamp Program just had its 30th anniversary. Well, geez, we're almost coming up on the 40th anniversary. The first stamps were issued in the mid 80s and we've raised over $4.5 million and it's resulted in over 12,000 acres of wetlands conserved in the state. So it's conservation of those wetland functions and at the same time, public land for wildlife-based recreation. That's everything from hunting, fishing to simply bird watching.
I have a quick question on, there was, as you may know, a Snake Mountain in Weybridge. My understanding is it was sold at a very low price. Someone said to me $1 to the state in like the 1950s or something became a wildlife management area. But the former owners retained timber rights. And I'm just wondering how much of, do you have a rough idea of how much of our wildlife management areas are logged on any kind of regular basis? It was a surprise to many residents because they just hadn't seen it logged for so long.
Yeah.
They were surprised to see any activity at all. And the agency was very helpful in explaining how it worked, what kind of review there was to make sure the activities were appropriate from a water quality standpoint, a habitat point of view, all that stuff. But you know how people are so sensitive to seeing anything new happen.
Certainly.
It was a surprise to people.
Yeah, no doubt. Snake Mountain is one of a handful of wildlife management areas where the department does not own the timber rights. Our Pond Woods Wildlife Management Area down in Benson and Orwell is another. I can think of 2 down in our Springfield district that don't as well. I can certainly get the number and provide statistics for the committee at a later date. But yeah, back in the 50s and 60s, the Department of Fish and Wildlife accepted either donations or $10 consideration parcels for public stewardship, but the sellers retained the logging rights. It is a priority for us to sort of reunify those bundle of sticks on those properties wherever we can. And we're actually very close to closing on an acquisition of the timber rights at our Pond Woods Wildlife Management Area. It's over 1,100 acres, I want to say, and the timber rights there are owned by the A. Johnson Company. They've been fantastic partners in working with us to get those timber rights back. That'll actually be coming to the Legislative Joint Fiscal Committee at a soon time because it is a significant bargain sale, which we're thankful for the A. Johnson Company.
Yeah.
On Snake Mountain, that's another one where we don't own the timber rights, but owning the timber rights or not, our wildlife management areas, but save some reserve areas, are managed. And by managed, I mean timber harvests. Timber harvests improve forage habitat and create new successional habitat for a whole host of species. So we do manage, and specifically timber manage, on all of our properties.
Thank you.
I think we might be toward the end of what I had. Oh, just a slide here. I wanted to make sure I mentioned kind of the nitty gritty of our EPA grant. This was the result of the good efforts by Senator Leahy, and we got very nice assurances from our current Senate leadership that they are hoping to continue this program. It's been a great boon for us. We get the chunks of money in these federal work plans, which coincide with the federal fiscal year. They go to the Lake Champlain Basin program and then come into the Department of Environmental Conservation, where Laura works, and Fish and Wildlife has access to those funds. We've created an interagency steering committee to manage the funds, which Laura and I are on. We evaluate the projects to make sure that they're hitting the project criteria, which is the one sentence test for the program is the property must have a change in land use, which results in 40% or more of the property being converted back to wetlands. So we do all types of things like plugging drainage ditches on ag fields, removing tile drains, creating wetland depressions with contractors, getting big yellow equipment out there to actually create what we think the natural processes would have resulted in at this point. Again, the program strives for 40% of the properties being restorable to wetlands. We're currently at about 77%. So we feel pretty good about it. And then just finally wanted to mention a few additional funding sources that are critical in this arena. Some of the things that folks in the committee might not be familiar with. We mentioned the habitat stamp. But U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we get our annual funding of what we call PR money. It's from the Pittman-Robertson Act. That money's apportioned from U.S. Fish and Wildlife to the several states. Vermont Housing Conservation Board has been an amazing partner for our projects when we need federal match. They're open ears for all of our project applications and has resulted in some great conservation success stories. As Laura mentioned before, the Ducks Unlimited in lieu fee program. Again, our department is uniquely situated in where we want to be the ultimate landowner for these conservation projects. We have the expertise and the staff to monitor and manage these things. We have some Clean Water Board monies that came our way during COVID times because of surplus federal funds in other areas. And then private fundraising is a big part of what we do as well. And then finally, I promised my fish division colleagues I'd give a shout out to the incredible work that they do. Again, I'm in the wildlife division, but we all work together. The Fish and Wildlife Fish Division has worked with DEC to create standards for culverts and bridges to make sure that they are up to flood resilient standards. But our primary pursuit there is often aquatic organism passage. The department assessed about 60 municipal structures in areas that were heavily impacted by the July floods. And we found that culverts and bridges that were replaced to those standards held up. They weren't impacted by the flooding. And as I said before, our fish division staff are all about woody additions to streams. So we had efforts after the flooding to really work with towns and landowners to see, what should come out of the streams? How should it come out of the streams? Because not only does it provide critical fish habitat, but it's water storage. Log jams slow down the river, trees and large boulders that have fallen into undeveloped areas really slow down the water and store it upstream from these downtowns. So I guess the overarching message here today is we are looking statewide, and we're looking all over for funding sources to continue to try and replicate and restore what these properties want to do.
Great. All right, any committee questions for Mr. Duane? Well, thank you. You know, on that field trip, when we were in a 3 Mile Bridge around there, it was like standing next to a very slow moving ocean of water.
Yeah.
It was impressive how much water there was and how slowly it was moving.
And then the wildlife response to that is where we get most excited. You know, you see eagles and herons and egrets in places you wouldn't see them. And there are pike that end up out in these fields, and that they take it for spawning habitat, and they find their way back into the river. It's fascinating what the wildlife does during these flood events.
Okay. Thank you again. All right.
Chair Bray,
Yes.
my apologies. Both
Okay.
Senator McCormick and I have our hands up, and I think we were
Okay.
hoping to ask for questions.
Yes, please. I can't see you the way the screen is set up, so please go ahead.
I think Senator McCormick beat me to it, raising his hand, so I'll defer.
I'll defer to the junior senator from
And also, Mr. Duane, I think you're still sharing your screen, so we see your, okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. And it's clear that there's a lot of enthusiasm in your department, and that makes me excited for potentially providing more support to make sure that your work can be done to a greater extent. So you just made one comment that stuck out to me that I just wanted to circle back to because it surprised me. So you said that fish grow on trees.
Yeah.
And I do not understand that conceptually, and I'm wondering if you could just take a moment to just explain that a little bit more.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if there are certain types of trees.
It's a sort of a goofy saying that we have, and we have some funny PowerPoint slides of just that, but those are a bit nonsensical. What we mean by that is that channelized, straight shot streams, specifically for trout, Vermont's trout species, are too warm, too shallow, and are not suitable habitat. What the rivers want to do is provide that habitat for the fish. They want to jump their banks and create oxbows and spread out. For fish habitat, we want to add woody debris and boulders to the streams to slow down the water as it goes through. And every little nook and cranny provides potential spawning habitat for trout. They need these little carve outs, these little dig outs, these kind of undercut banks. All these differences in the water current in the area provide refuge for them for both spawning and for them to hide out during these crazy high water events. There definitely was a hit to living fish populations during the storm. We could provide follow-up information about what we think the impacts were, but the fish need a place to hide out too. So when we say they grow on trees, it means that the more debris, and typically that means trees, in the river channel is a benefit to the fish habitat, and as we've found out, beneficial for human communities downstream.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. I've got to tell you, I've enjoyed this morning's testimony in that I'm used to getting bad news. I mean, we're losing ground on global warming, for example, or if nothing else, we're barely keeping up. It's certainly not doing what we could be doing. And that's the case. I have concerns about our pending changes to our land use policies and so on. It looks to me, if I heard you right, that we're basically doing okay with our wetlands.
Let me qualify my response at first by saying I am not a biologist. I'm not a biologist by training. I would like to say that from the perspective of doing what we can to conserve and restore wetlands, we're doing okay. But as Laura mentioned in her testimony this morning, you know, the figure of wetlands that we lost, I can't remember the year that you had mentioned there, Laura, but it's pretty staggering, the number that's lost. And we feel like we're making good strides on our wetland restoration efforts, but, you know, great success in this program has been just over 1,000 acres of wetlands restored. And that's really exciting. But when you think about the percentages that were lost, it may just be a drop in the bucket. So we got smart people working on the problem. We have dedicated, enthusiastic staff working on it. I think if you were to ask us how we're doing, I think the general sentiment would be like, we feel like we're heading in the right direction, but there's always more we can do.
Sarah Watson.
Thank you. So I guess I want to ask the same question that I asked Laura. See if you have anything to add, right? Like, you know, it seems like y'all are doing great work. Are there bottlenecks? What are they? How can we best support your work?
Yeah, I think capacity and funding are always more welcome. I'm sure you hear that from every state employee who comes in discussing what they need. We have great management here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife who's helping us to focus our efforts on these important things. I know the committee probably hears about other aspects of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and maybe that's what Senator McCormick was referring to when he said he only gets bad news. We feel like we're in a pretty good spot. I will leave it to those who will be in to testify about the merits of the bill later on to discuss exactly, you know, what we think we need to continue doing this work. But I think the through line that you'll probably hear is more funding, more capacity, and I would not disagree with that.
Any other questions for Mr. Dwayne? Okay. All right, so shifting gears a little bit from wetlands to dams. Good to see you again, Mr. Green. Thanks for coming back. Unfortunately, because of folks traveling and being away at their other non-legislative jobs, not everyone will do your presentation in December. So I'm sorry to ask you to do some repetition, but we're on the bill, so we're good to come back up to full speed for everybody. Thanks.
Okay, great. I'll share my screen here. Okay, hopefully you're all viewing the title page slide.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. My name is Ben Green. I'm the section chief, dam safety engineer at the Department of Environmental Conservation Dam Safety Program. Thank you very much for the invitation to come in and meet again with you and present and discuss dam safety and dam safety in Vermont. This presentation has a little bit of a different twist. I'm not going to go so much into the floods. I'm going to talk more about our rulemaking, recent rulemaking efforts, and as well as a little bit about S213. So in the way, just a general presentation overview. Again, I'm going to do kind of a general overview of our program, talk about our ownership and regulation responsibilities, and then rulemaking, and hopefully, well, not doing a line by line, but to go over some general thoughts about S213. So this slide is, it was in an earlier presentation, but just to recap, our program is located in the Water Investment Division within the Department of Environmental Conservation. Our mission statement is noted here. I guess one thing I'd just like to call out regarding our mission statement is it differs from most within ANR and DEC, particularly. Our primary mission is not environmental conservation; it's actually public safety, particularly public safety relative to dams. And so it's a little bit of a different twist. Our primary responsibilities are dam regulation and dam ownership. On the regulatory side, we regulate non-hydropower, non-federal dams. And on the ownership side, we are directly responsible for 14 state-owned dams, including the 3 Winooski River flood control dams. In terms of the timing, it's kind of seasonal depending on what we're doing more of, but it's probably pretty accurate to say it's roughly a 50-50 split in terms of our time spent. Our current staffing is currently 5 full-time employees. We have 2 licensed engineers, myself being one and the other being a limited service position. We have 2 staff engineers, one of which is a limited service position, and we also have a program administrator that we recently hired who is also limited service. On the regulatory side, we operate under 10 VSA Chapter 43 dams, and as I kind of noted on the ownership side, we're directly responsible for 14 dams.
I'm just to mention, I'm guessing you're aware, but I talked with Senator Westman, and he's coming in to introduce S218, which addresses staffing for the division, and I hope and expect that one way or the other, if that either rolls into this bill or it travels as part of the budget itself. But
yep, that sounds great. Thank you for that. Just in a way of some more information about our program, I just wanted to briefly go over our legislative and staffing histories. I think as I noted in my previous presentation, Vermont was actually the first state in the nation to enact dam safety laws in 1876, which is kind of cool to think. Other major legislative changes in 1929, a permit program was added for dams, and in the early 1980s, Chapter 43, the statute that still is used to this day, was enacted. And more currently, in 2018, Act 161 passed that changed the authorities of the dam safety program, and really started this fairly significant paradigm shift that we're still getting in place in regards to dam safety. So just a brief staffing overview of our program. So in the early years of our program, I believe it was run by the dam safety was regulated by the Water Resources Board. This is back in the 30s to perhaps in the 60s. There are potentially other entities as well. We don't have great records. The dam safety program, as you know today, really came into effect in the 1970s, which was also the advent of really public interest in non-federal dams. We had a list of capable predecessors who worked with limited staffing and limited funding ranges. During this period from the 1970s to the late, till basically 2020, the program largely consisted of a staff of 2 engineers. It ballooned up and down slightly at a few different times, but an average had 2 engineers. And our predecessors largely dealt with a staffing of that and limited resources when it came to managing state-owned dams and dam ownership. I came on in 2017. When I started, it was just myself and one other engineer, Stephen Hanna. We were the dam safety program. Thankfully, in 2022, we were able to add 2 limited service positions on 5-year contracts. Just earlier in 2023, we added a limited service position for a program administrator. By and large, really our goal for the future is for the first time in program history, get this program properly staffed to more effectively do 2 objectives. One, stand up an A&R dam ownership program, meaning for the first time really perform active oversight and maintenance of A&R owned dams, bring A&R dams up to and keep in compliance with upcoming dam safety rules, and also just have staff capability to shepherd projects, through the process of keeping them in good condition and rehabilitating them and or removing them, doing whatever makes the most sense, but someone who can kind of keep a better finger on the pulse of that. And the second piece is the regulatory program, the other 50% of our work, which again, with with the upcoming rules, we're going to be kind of moving to a more modern safety standards. And so it's a considerably good amount of additional work that needs to be done to take a more proactive approach to dam safety regulation, where historically it's been more reactive or even passive. So let's talk a little bit about our ownership side of things. DEC directly owns 14 dams, as I mentioned earlier. As a whole, A&R, meaning Fish and Wildlife, FPR, and DEC own 100 dams, which makes us actually the largest single dam owner in the state. Typical dam ownership tasks are listed over here to the right. We undertake these all directly on our own 14 dams and then assist other A&R departments with some of these things. There's day-to-day operational things. There's emergency action planning, incident response, and flood monitoring. There's the capital planning, design, permitting, construction, project management. There's quite a bit of work that needs to get done. The state's highest risk dam assets are the Winooski River flood control dams. Some basic data on the dams are provided here, but they provide an important measure of flood reduction along the Winooski River, particularly in areas around Barre, Montpelier, and Waterbury, and areas downstream along the Winooski River. These were built in the 1930s and have been under the state control ever since. One of the most critical tasks that we as the program perform on the ownership side of our responsibilities is relative to the flood control dams and the flood monitoring work that we do. This includes stationing staff at the dams to perform these tasks during flooding, communicating with the state management, communicating with the State Emergency Operations Center, communicating with downstream communities, assessing the performance of the dams during the event, post-event, as well as making critical operations, as well as identification and completion of minor post-flood repairs. While this task is largely focused on our 3 Winooski River flood control dams, we also try to keep a close eye on our other high and significant hazard dams that we're directly responsible for.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
One is on the communication side. Is there someone with overarching management of communications with downstream towns and ensuring that there's evacuation plans so that as someone assesses the risk, the towns themselves know what actions are appropriate to take? Does that fall to you, or does the state provide that service to municipalities? And if so, in the state, who does that part?
Sure. So our dams and really like any high hazard, significant hazard dams are fairly similar in this regard. Ideally, these dams have what's called an emergency action plan. It's a pre-developed plan in place that kind of identifies if you were to have an incident or a failure of a dam, where the floodwaters could go, what areas would need to be evacuated, and then some basic procedures and communication requirements in the event of you have a flood or an adverse condition at the dam. When it comes to actually managing that emergency on the ground, it's a little bit of a different thing. So dam owners, currently they're not required to have an emergency action plan. That's something the new rules we're working on will require, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the slides. But ideally, every dam would have an emergency action plan. The owner is responsible for developing it, maintaining it, and sharing it. However, the dam owner does not have the authority to manage regional or local emergencies. That falls to typically the local incident commander in individual towns. So that's often the fire chief or other. So when this works as well as it can, the dam owner and the incident commander in the downstream impacted towns are on the same page. They both are familiar with the plan and have open line of communication. And the dam owner can communicate critical information to the incident commander or the fire chief. And in the ideal world, they will have taken the emergency action plan and kind of built their own response plan off of that to identify what areas they want to evacuate first, where critical zones could be, where critical travel access areas could be impacted, et cetera. So that's when it works as well as it can. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, emergency action plans have not historically been a requirement that we could compel owners to have. That's changing. That's the first element. And the second element is that the capability and capacity of incident commanders across the state vary widely from town to town. In some cases, it's a professional, highly trained staff member. In other cases, it's essentially assigned to nobody. So.
Thank you. Senator Watson.
Actually, my question got resolved. I guess I've just never seen this, the picture of the Wrightsville Dam 1 foot, below the flood, before this, below the spillway, which is like, that's a really valuable picture. So thank you.
No problem. So I think hopefully this will play. This next slide here is just a very short video giving an example of flood operations at Waterbury Dam. It's going to play. This is us just operating the dam, discharging floodwaters following a flood in spring of 2019. This is just meant to give an idea of the scale of the operations we perform. And typically from an operable event where we start to store floodwaters at Waterbury Dam, to where we start with gate closure and start to store floodwaters to the point where we've operated the dams continually and brought floodwaters back down to normal levels. That can be as much as a week or more, a fairly significant on-site time to make that happen safely. So now I'd just like to move on to ownership challenges with ANR owned dams. Approximately 40% of ANR owned dams are in poor, unsatisfactory condition and out of compliance with upcoming dam safety rules. Nearly 80% of ANR dams are more than 50 years old. This really means that in many cases that the dam, or at least components of the dam, are at or near their original design life. A very rough estimate to rehabilitate ANR owned dams, excluding the flood control dams, because they're kind of on a scale of all themselves, is in the $20 to $25 million range. Frankly, as time goes on and we learn more, I think that number is going to go up somewhat significantly.
Is there a history of capital grants? I mean, is that an institutions committee doing capital grants? Is that your usual funding stream for these projects?
Yeah, typically capital funding is one source, and then we also have a unique general fund source at the moment. I actually have a following slide talks a little bit more about that.
Okay.
One further question. Something we've talked about already in this committee is the potential for dam removal. And so I'm wondering if these dams are 50 years old, are they still serving, generally speaking, like, are they still serving an important function, or do you think dam removal would be advisable for any of these dams?
Yeah, absolutely, and I believe the best way to approach any of these projects, we have some of these dams that are aging, they pose an unacceptable risk and they're in poor condition. One of the first tasks that should be done is an alternatives analysis to kind of sort that issue out to see, does it really make sense to continue to invest in this dam? The initial capital investment to rehabilitate it, and then not to mention the upcoming annual necessary investments that's needed to maintain it into the future, or does this dam not serve a useful purpose and does it make more sense for it to be removed? So I think removal is definitely an important element in this, and definitely an option that should essentially be at least considered in all cases. I've certainly seen situations where dam owners are vehemently against it, but as they run a true alternatives analysis, it ends up being the most viable option. So it's certainly an important option in the quiver.
And is that, I assume to do alternatives analysis, you would need like some special funding to do that, or, right, like that's not already baked into your budget?
Yes, I mean, alternatives analysis would really be part of the preliminary engineering work. If you have a dam that's in poor condition and poses unacceptable risk, and it's time to, determine the best route forward for this dam, and then, design and permit that final solution, it would ultimately kind of be part of that process. It kind of needs to be. First, you need to do some basic engineering analyses to really understand what exactly we're dealing with, and then based on that, you can look at different alternatives for rehabilitation, repair, or removal. So, and you can kind of work through those. What would be the outcomes? What would be the pros and cons? What would be the estimated costs, et cetera? And that kind of allows you to make an educated decision. Of course, it is there's a cost associated with that exercise, but it's hugely informing to making the right choice moving forward.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
The other point I wanted to make is that despite being the largest dam owner in the state, between the three departments, DEC, FPR, and Fish and Wildlife, there's a lack of coordinated ANR dam management strategy, or we call it dam owner safety program. Fortunately, this does lead to both important dam safety tasks falling through the cracks, as well as some inefficiency as different programs try to tackle similar challenges. Now, while the lack of a dam safety owner program or coordinated compliance strategy has been able to kind of persist over time due to the regulatory atmosphere in Vermont being largely voluntary, as we start to move to a more proactive regulatory stance with the upcoming rules, that will really no longer be acceptable, and we're going to end up with a lot of uncompliant dams if we continue on the path that we're on. at the ANR dam level to help get a better understanding of the vulnerabilities and consequences of our 18 high and significant hazard dams, 18 of the 100. We commissioned a risk assessment project to identify the highest risk dams. This was done for a couple of reasons. Number one, to prioritize projects with limited available funding to effectively buy down or reduce the state's risk exposure relative to their dams. This is also very helpful as it serves as a starting point or a roadmap for addressing issues in our dam portfolio. The graphic at the bottom of this slide is from a study from the entity that we hired, RTI International, that ranks the 18 dams in the study from the highest risk, which is on the left, to the lowest risk on the right, relatively speaking. So it doesn't mean that the dam on the far right does not have any risk, just relative to the 18 that we selected for the study, it has the lowest risk. So in terms of leveraging this information, it tells us where we put our money to best buy down risk and address critical safety issues. Note that Waterbury Dam is not included in this study, as it's kind of in a class of its own. It's on its own track with a very large separate project. And there was also a couple other ANR owned dams that were already sort of in the study and engineering phase. And so since they're already kind of heading down a certain direction, they were not included in this study.
Could you say a little more about the key hydrologic versus normal in terms of the risk score, please?
Sure. So the risk score is additive between basically those two style of loading conditions, whether it be hydrologic, which is essentially a flood condition, versus a normal loading condition. Typically, in most cases, and in many cases, the flood loading condition does kind of overwhelm. But basically, when they did the risk profile, they looked at various loading conditions, and then they evaluated how the dam would perform under those loading conditions. And then really the hydrologic versus normal just shows kind of what percentages of each of those went to the total risk score. So for example, East Barry, you see there is all blue, meaning it's all hydrologic. Well, East Barry Dam is a unique case. It doesn't actually have a normal pool. Under normal conditions, it's called a dry dam. It's basically just a river that meanders through a culvert through the dam. So under a normal condition, there really is no normal loading condition. So that one is 100% impacted by flood in terms of the risk profile. Others you see is perhaps a little bit more of a mismatch, 50-50 or 40-60 or something like that, depending on the individual dam and its vulnerabilities.
Okay, and just for learning more while we're here, so Wrightsville has a significant risk related to the flooding loading, the hydrologic loading. But what's the risk that remains? The gray bar, like what would that mean in terms of what's going on at the dam?
Sure. So one thing with risk, when you do a risk analysis like this on a portfolio level, is that while we did spend a handsome sum of money, $445,000 to be able to do this, it's still, when you have 18 dams in the study, you end up with somewhat of a mismatch of quality of existing information on dams. So in some cases, we just didn't know critical parameters very well. For example, we may not have known the geology in the site very well because there had not ever been test borings, or we didn't know for whatever reason, we didn't have structural plans of an element of the dam, so it was hard to evaluate. So in those cases, conservative estimates were made, and really one of the first things to do is to go out and try to fill those data gaps. And in some cases, so that normal loading condition is probably associated with the performance of the embankment or the performance of the principal spillway tunnel of the dam, which is a portion of the dam that's loaded under all conditions, and probably related to some uncertainty as to critical parameters.
Okay, thank you.
So our main sources of funding for ANR owned dams are capital funding, and also we currently have a one-time general funding allotment. As mentioned, the focus of the money that we have currently available is to start to attack work projects at the 18 dams, starting with the highest risk projects and moving down to not only reduce the risk of the dams, but also to ultimately work towards bringing ANR dams to compliance with upcoming rules. So again, we currently have one-time funding, a general fund allotment of $5 million, of which we've worked pretty well into to work on dams. also as part of that general fund, that was out of that 5 million was how we were able to hire our 2 temporary engineering positions that we currently have. And then we also have capital funding that we usually go for each year for specific projects. And we are fortunate at the moment to actually have a pretty good sum at 3.5 million. And we're looking forward to hopefully putting both of these funds to full use in the next year or two to get as many projects going as possible. Is there a question?
Well, I guess I do have a question. So just thinking about like the capital funding that you have, 3.5 million, and thinking about like the need to either rehabilitate dams and anyway, so that's not gonna be enough to, I'm assuming that's not gonna be enough to like rehabilitate the dams. I guess what I'm saying is there's still a need. That's really
It's an excellent start, and hopefully it's some kind of a signal of future funding commitment, because we're going to need, it's a great start, but we're going to need more as we move through the portfolio for sure.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Mr.
Senator
Chairman?
Bright. Oh, yeah, I believe Senator McCormick has a question as well.
Thank you, Senator McCormick.
Yeah, I just want to verify, am I correct? We have this list of dams with varying degrees of threat or, possible problems. Am I correct in presuming that any dam that's not on this list, on this chart, I should just presume is okay?
So on this chart, we focused on high and significant hazard potential dams. So those are dams that, as we understand them today, in the event of an incident or a failure, would cause either potential loss of life or significant property damage. The remaining dams in our portfolio are what's called low hazard potential dams, which dams, if they were to fail, would present lesser losses. So that's why we haven't evaluated them on this level. Not to say they're not important, and many of them do have some critical function, whether it be recreation or other important things that they do. But from a risk standpoint, they don't pose a high risk, so that's why they have not been evaluated. Again, this is simply evaluating things simply by the public safety risk that the dams pose, and so that's why these 18 were selected.
And are you basing it on the likelihood of the dam failing or on the consequences that certain dams, the failure would matter more than?
Yes, exactly. Actually, both of those. Risk evaluates what's the probability of a loading condition that could cause an adverse condition at the dam, and then if that were to happen, what would be the resulting downstream impacts. And so basically this analysis takes those elements into account, and a dam that would fail during could potentially fail during a relatively small flood and have I'm just giving an example here, but a dam that could fail during a relatively small flood and have a high consequence number would rank as an unacceptable risk. And then a dam that would only have a problem during a very remote flood and have a very low number consequence would rank as a dam that would be less likely to be pursued and would be considered a lower risk. So that's sort of how the mechanics work.
And my final, I presume this has probably already been covered, and I wasn't listening carefully enough, but you have, if not authority, at least you look at every dam in the state. Or say the North Springfield Dam,
sure,
which is the Army Corps of Engineers, right? But do you look at that? Is that included in the?
No. So right now, this assessment is strictly just A&R, a portfolio of 100 A&R dams, and I'm reviewing dams that the state owns. That's 50% of what we do. The other portion of what we do is dam regulation, and our regulatory authorities are limited to non-hydropower, non-federal dams. So that's dams that do not produce hydropower, or dams that are not federally owned or regulated. So a Springfield Dam, for example, that you mentioned, or Springfield Dam that you mentioned, that would be a federally owned dam. They actually are self-regulating, so we don't have any authority that facility.
And Connecticut River dams are all in New Hampshire, but we have part of something to do with that, right?
Correct, and those are power dams, so those are regulated at the federal level by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And again, our statute does not provide us any authority at those facilities either.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So on the tune of dam projects, I just want to provide a partial list of some dam-related projects that were ongoing in 2023. This list is not everything that we were doing, but just some of the more major ones. Just to call out a few, the Wrightsville Dam Spillway Maintenance Project was completed, which included tree removal, rock cut maintenance in the auxiliary spillway, as well as drainage improvements in the auxiliary spillway. We also performed comprehensive assessment projects at Noise Pond Dam and Silver Lake Dam, which is really the first step to move them towards, included in alternatives analysis, really the first step in determining what the next best steps are and set up for, designing the next and then essentially moving to implementation. And then another major project that we had was the Waterbury Dam Risk Reduction Project that's currently ongoing. It's a project to address some overstressing issues that we have in one of the gates and hoist bridges to allow for safer operation of the floodgates there until the larger spillway replacement project, I imagine you're all somewhat familiar with, can occur in the next, say, 5 years. So it's really a Band-Aid, temporary Band-Aid to get us some safer operations in the short term. That kind of rolls right into the large Waterbury Dam Spillway project. This is really probably the biggest ownership initiative project that we have going, and we're very thankful to be working with the Army Corps of Engineers New England District on it. This is a slide from a previous presentation as well, so I apologize, but for just those not aware, this is a project that's been around really since the early 2000s when the floodgates experienced jamming due to concrete deterioration. Subsequent structural analyses of the gates determined that the gates can only safely hold back about 75% of the design flood that the facility was designed for. And we've been operating under that restriction since around 2005. The current project, which would be to repair the floodgates and spillway system and basically restore it to 100% capacity, is currently estimated in the $70 to $100 million range. It includes the elements called out in this figure here. From a schedule standpoint, we're currently what's called modification study, which will hopefully finish up later this year. And then ultimately we'll move to design in 2025 and 2026 with construction perhaps as soon as 2027. But it's a very major undertaking project at our highest risk, crown jewel of the state's portfolio dam.
Mr. Green, when it says flood load restriction, does that mean that because of jamming, you have to keep the amount of pressure on them down, so you have to release more? You can't let as much water accumulate there as you might otherwise?
Exactly. The dams, when we reach roughly 75% loading on the dam in terms of the amount of water that's stored behind the gates, I shouldn't say gates, not dam. When we reach about 75% of the water load behind on the height of the gate, if we didn't have that load restriction, we would just keep storing until we got to 100%, and then we'd have a procedure for starting to slowly discharge water. However, when we hit 75%, we're at risk of having the gate not be able to handle more load, so we have to start opening the gates at that point. So essentially, we essentially partially abandoned flood control at about 75% design load as opposed to the original design 100% design load.
Thank you.
Another kind of important notable project that's in the early stages is the DEC Dam Instrumentation Evaluation Project. The objective of this project is to improve remote monitoring of our dam inventory and allow for better prioritization of issues, particularly during flooding events. With a limited staff, being able to have kind of instrumentation and remote eyes and ears at a lot of these facilities would be very helpful, which we don't really have that right now. The two elements of the project are: one is really a major instrumentation overhaul at Waterbury Dam. Much of the instrumentation that is at Waterbury Dam was installed kind of a smorgasbord over a variety of years, starting in the late 1970s up through the early 2000s. A lot of those systems are well past their design lives and failing. So the intent of the program is to rehabilitate that instrumentation, as well as get basic instrumentation installations at our other DEC-owned dams, so that again we can kind of have eyes and ears on these dams when we're not there. Basic data we'd be collecting would be water levels and photographs at a minimum, and potentially some weather data, so we can understand kind of what's going on at all the facilities at any given time from remote location. And the goal is to make the system scalable. So hopefully in time we get our 14 DEC dams up on this system, and then we can select key A&R dams to add to the system over time, just again to help have better monitoring on these facilities. Although not a main focus of our program, we are responsible for the management of some state lands that are related to our ownership of dams. Just to name a few of the main ones, we manage a hydropower easement with Washington Electric Co-op at the Wrightsville Dam. We are also responsible for the operation and maintenance of the Shade Row picnic area, as well as the Wrightsville boat ramp in Middlesex. At East Barry Dam in Barrytown, we manage leases with a model airplane club, farmer, as well as the town of Washington, who has a ball field on our property. In general, land management, although certainly necessary, is on occasion quite time consuming and really outside of our public safety mission. So sometimes it's something we struggle really to do adequately. Other initiatives and challenges we have in our program is one of the things that comes up pretty much annually is the pressure to take on ownership of additional dams. For example, the Green River Reservoir Dam and Dike, we're currently managing a roughly $350,000 study to evaluate the state taking ownership of that dam and moving forward. That's kind of an extreme example, but we have lesser examples as well. Just last year, we also evaluated Sunrise Lake Dam in the Benson area for FPR to see if that made sense to bring that under state ownership. A&R is already the largest dam owner in the state. I feel like we have a lot of work to do to get our own portfolio in order. So the possibility of taking on additional dams when the dams that we own are in need of attention is fairly intimidating.
On Sunrise, which I think maybe an owner has been found for the adjoining the old Boy Scout property, will the new owner acquire the liability, ownership and liability related to that dam?
Yes. Ultimately, dam owners are responsible, fully responsible for the risk and liability of dam ownership. So whomever takes either title to the dam or title to the land underlying the dam will have that responsibility.
Yeah. Thank you.
So now I'd like just to shift gears, get away from talking about our ownership work and talk about our regulation work. I just want to start with a simple slide that just kind of depicts how the regulatory atmosphere in Vermont works. There's overall four regulators, four different entities that regulate dams. We're the Department of Environmental Conservation. We regulate the majority of dams, non-hydropower, non-federal. And also at the state level, you have the Public Utility Commission, who regulates hydropower dams at the state level. We have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who regulates hydropower dams. At the federal level, there's a key date in there that kind of determines which entity the dam's regulated by. And then I have listed here the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but really any federally owned dam is self-regulated. So whether that be the Army Corps of Engineer owned dam or the U.S. Park Service, et cetera, that dam is self-regulated. So that's kind of how the breakup of regulation works in the state. This also is a slide from a previous presentation, but just to review quickly hazard potential classifications. I know we've kind of talked a little bit about it on the ownership side, but these were fairly newly adopted definitions. And basically it has to do with what would be the consequence downstream should there be instant or failure of a dam. And each dam is provided a ranking here. A high hazard dam is one that in the event of instant or failure probably result in probable loss of life. On the other end of the scale, we have lower minimal hazard dams that if there was a failure, it would have no anticipated loss of life and minor, if any, property losses, lifeline losses, or environmental losses. A couple key things to remember about hazard class is the assignment is dynamic. It can change over time. Changes in downstream development can make them go up. If you have a cow pasture with a dam on it, it may be a low hazard dam. If that becomes a housing development downstream of that dam, it may become a high hazard dam. It's really no fault necessarily to the dam owner, but the dam owners, it's their responsibility to therefore adjust their facility and meet the higher standard of react to the changes in downstream development. It's kind of an unfortunate consequence of dam ownership. And lastly, a hazard potential classification is independent of condition. So it's solely related to downstream impacts. Here's just another repeat slide from before. This one of our responsibilities on the regulatory side is to inventory dams in the state. We maintain an inventory that was passed on to us from our predecessors. We've made it web-based, and looking to make even more improvements to it. Here's just some breakouts of numbers in terms of the number of high, significant, low, and minimal hazard dams by the different regulatory entities from a few slides back.
Senator Watson?
Thank you. I realize this is a little bit tangential from what you are talking about, but just in looking at the slide, right, we talking about like active and historic sites. I am, when we think about the options for a dam and whether or not it can be removed, sometimes there might be like historic a historic value to a dam. Is there such a thing as like a historic dam, and that historic nature of it might prevent it from being eligible from being removed?
I have not seen historic necessarily block or a full removal project. Certainly they've required, in my experience at least, documentation of the dam prior. I've run more into requirements in terms of rehabilitation. You run into some historic restrictions where you sort of have to work very hard to meld meeting modern standards with meeting historic requirements. In some cases, you have to get a little inventive with how to design the dam to to best perform best, meet modern standard, while also getting the support of the historic folks.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. I'll talk more about our ongoing rulemaking work, but Chapter 43 is a legislation that guides regulation of the dams in the state for both the DEC and the Public Utility Commission. It underwent major changes in 2018 as Act 161, which I mentioned I'll talk more about, but basically gives us basic jurisdictions, the bifurcation between DEC and PUC, authorizations for permitting, has a public good criteria requirement, a dam inspection requirement, has a provision for handling unsafe dams. To kind of quickly move through some of the other administrative tasks that we're required to perform in our program is an annual dam registration program. It's an annual fee that's charged to dam owners that compound greater than 500,000 cubic feet. It first started in 2016, and really the intent of it was to raise funds in order to hire additional staff. Unfortunately, that was never realized. The fees range from a high hazard dam had to pay $1,000 a year to a low hazard dam having to pay $200 per year. It has the potential to raise roughly $130,000 a year. And it is somewhat of a challenging program to administer. We are currently working to try to recover roughly $65,000 in unpaid fees. The way the program is designed, it can't encumber title, so we have owners that are difficult to collect this from. It is fairly unpopular in the dam owner community, but really the intent of it, I think, was to try to make this program more financially independent, which has its advantages. One of the long-standing portions of our work in this program is our periodic inspection program. It's really, we do these inspections for the purpose of they're visual inspections, and they're done really for the purpose of assessing a condition rating for dams. And it's also an opportunity to identify non-compliant issues with dams and provide recommendations to dam owners on how to bring their dams into compliance. Rulemaking performed to date has established a schedule for when these need to be done. It's every 2 years for a high hazard, 5 for a significant, 10 for a low, and minimal hazards do not have a periodic inspection requirement. We've recently developed an iPad solution to help document data in the field as well as do reporting, which has been pretty helpful. We usually try to perform roughly 50 to 100 inspections per year. Some years we do more, some years it's unfortunately a little bit less. But this is kind of a cornerstone of our program, and kind of really what our initial predecessors did a lot of to try to get their handle around what the inventory of dams are and what the condition are of dams in the state. Another longstanding activity in our program is dam orders or permits. They're called orders in our statute. They're required for new construction, alteration, rehabilitation, or removal of projects capable of impounding more than 500,000 cubic feet, which is very hard to imagine, but that's really, you get up to roughly a couple acre size pond or larger in general. We typically process roughly 5 a year, sometimes more, sometimes less. Typically includes an application that a professional engineer hired by the owner develops that includes an engineering analyses and plans and specifications, which we review and either ultimately approve or deny. There is a public comment period to review the projects, and after which typically most of them go the direction of an order eventually being issued, and then it's our responsibility to kind of manage the order, make sure the conditions in the order are followed and closed out. Emergency action planning is another element of the work that we do. I guess we kind of already talked about this a little bit and explained what an emergency action plan was. Historically, we've not had the authority to require dam owners to develop or maintain emergency action plans. So we're a little behind the times here. New upcoming rules will require owners both develop and update their plans, which will be hugely helpful. Many of the existing EAPs on file were actually developed through and paid for through FEMA grants that our predecessors secured. So we actually use those grants to pay for both private and municipal dams to have EAPs developed, which was positive because we got EAPs, but ultimately didn't really result in owners taking ownership of the EAP. But that's going to change as we move forward with new rules. Just like on our dam ownership side, on our regulatory side, we also do dam incident flood response. We perform tasks like rapid and emergency inspections and also provide dam safety engineering and regulatory advice in these situations. Some recent examples are noted here: the Nissenbaum dam failure in Stowe in 2022, as well as our response and work to the July 2023 flood and December 2023 flood. You know, this is the sort of work that comes when it comes, and you just have to react, so it's hard to plan for. Our program also maintains at least one and sometimes two grants for dam safety through the FEMA. Annually we get a dam safety assistance grant, which is usually good for roughly $60,000 to $100,000 per year. We use it for the activities listed here. Due to increased federal funding in 2024, we're actually going to get a bump up to $246,000, and we're looking forward to leveraging that additional funds to do some good things. We're looking at hopefully hiring some help to get to perform inundation mapping for a bunch of additional dams in the state that currently don't have it. So, the high hazard potential dam grant is also a grant fund that FEMA has. It requires to be eligible for it. You have to have a high hazard dam that's in poor condition. There's a couple other requirements, but that's the main one. We actually won an award of $311,000 for this to study the 7 high hazard dams, 7 private and municipally owned dams in the state that are rated in poor condition that are high hazard. So rough, kind of our 7 worst high hazard dams, to do a risk assessment similar to the one we did on our own portfolio, but based on those 7 dams. And that was the results of that were completed in 2023. These 2 figures are from that final report. The upper table shows the 7 dams that were included in the study, and then the bottom table shows the risk ranking. Again, relative risk ranking. So it's not to say that number 7 is not risky. It just not the highest risk dam is listed as 1 through, as number 1. As being a part of this study now allows these owners to move forward, and they can apply for additional funding through FEMA's HHPD program to get funding to work on their project. It's a 35-65% match program, so they do need to come to the table with some funding. There are some challenges with this program. It's hard to get the funding to properly match your project size. We actually did not request $311,000. We actually requested a bit less, and then we couldn't meet the match requirements. So we had to kind of adjust our project and our scope, and it took some time to get the match together, and that can be a problem for a lot of owners as well. But overall, it is one of the few opportunities for funding for dams that's related to rehabilitation, and because there is many more opportunities for funding for removal.
Ms. Green, what's PMF stand for?
PMF, that stands for probable maximum flood, which is essentially a major flood.
Okay, thank you.
In our law, we also have the unsafe dam provision that allows us to deal with imminent safety conditions when we have either an unwilling or unable owner. It's kind of a longstanding part in our rule and pretty lightly, or in our statute, it's been pretty lightly used. It does come with some potential funding for an owner that's in that situation. Unfortunately, it's typically not enough to do a permanent solution, but it may be enough to do a temporary solution. Our most recent case of using this fund was, and using this element of our statute, was in just recently, this past fall, Rouleau Dam in Williamstown. The town of Williamstown brought a petition to our program for it to be part of the unsafe dam process. It was found to be a dam that needed to be dealt with. An order was issued to the owner to make the dam safe, essentially, and then funding was provided to partially breach the dam, to lower the water level several feet, that reduced loading on the dam, improved the dam stability, and also decreased the potential for consequences should the dam fail. And ultimately, this dam is slated for removal in the hopefully somewhat near future. So was the positive use of that element of our statute. Enforcement work. When we do come across enforcement issues, we do work with our environmental compliance division at DEC. Since our programs historically had somewhat of a passive approach to and passive authorities relative to dam safety, it's not been heavily used. Our most common issues that we find are unauthorized alterations to dams and things like that. So resulted in historically fairly low volume for enforcement. When we get these new rules in place, we are anticipating somewhat of a sizable uptick potentially as we run into owners that are out of compliance and are going to be unfortunately made to come into compliance, and probably will have a challenge doing so. Our dam safety program was audited. When the report came out in 2022, the audit really focused on a regulatory part of our program, specifically periodic inspections and inventorying. They identified some deficiencies in our program and recommended, in general, accelerated rulemaking, inspection and inventory improvements, and a staffing level assessment. We continue to hopefully continue to use this report to kind of leverage, improving our program moving forward. Perhaps skip over this one in time, but I guess to very quickly say, hazard potential classifications in the state, we're basically taking on, eventually evaluating every dam in the state, and we've developed a process to do that, and hopefully within not too much time, we will have every dam in the state evaluated from a hazard potential classification standpoint, because as I mentioned earlier, it's a dynamic classification, and we are finding that there are cases where dams are not properly classified. Now to move on to our current rulemaking. Our rulemaking was put in two phases, going in two phases as required by statute. Phase 1 was the administrative rules, which were adopted in 2020. And phase 2 are technical standards that are still in development. And right now we have an extension request in to hopefully complete this by 2025. We were making good progress this year until the July flood happened, and that has set us back quite a bit. And it's going to be probably a little while yet before we're able to pick it back up again, as we're still picking up the pieces from that flood. Just to kind of let you know the kind of rulemaking process that we've been following, and this is what we did during phase 1 and are striving to do during phase 2. But these rules are entirely new. They represent a paradigm shift in terms of how dams are regulated in the state. Historically, dam compliance was largely voluntary. Owners could participate or not even participate in in inspection programs. We could not compel owners to make safety changes unless it was literally an imminent failure scenario. And so it resulted in a very reactive or passive approach. And we're going to sort of be coming up to federal standards with these new rules and taking a much more proactive approach, requiring people to pay better attention to their dams and bring them up to compliance with modern standards. So it's a huge shift in how dams are regulated in the state. Since it's such a monumental shift, we developed for both sets of rules an interest group made up of dam owners, people impacted by the rule, essentially dam owners, engineering consultants, other state officials, etc., and have taken their input as the draft rules have been developed. We are also on phase 2 of the rules. The technical standards are planned to have a peer review done on the draft rule. And then also prior to entering formal rulemaking, as we did during phase 1, we actually did a dam safety workshop for dam owners We invited dam owners. I think roughly 130 people showed up, and we reviewed in detail the proposed rules and what it meant, and took kind of informal public comment and addressed those before, like I said, before entering the formal rulemaking. Again, it's a very drastic shift in how dams are regulated. So we've been trying to take these steps to educate people on the need and really what the changes are. Phase 1, dam safety rules. These are the main elements of the rule. Most notable, I would say, would be dam obligation and responsibility was defined in phase 1 of the rule. Dam owners are fully responsible for their dams, and nothing in the rule relieves an owner of that. There's also a requirement to record dams in the land records. This is a requirement that basically every dam in the state will be recorded in the local land records, so current and future owners will understand their responsibility. Some other notable things included periodic inspections, which historically were done completely by the program. In the future, we have the authority to require owners to do them as well, which means that they'd have to hire an engineer to do them. This is really a capacity issue. We struggle to get done sometimes the number of inspections that need to get done. And while we strive to do as many as we can, we will have the authority in the future for owners that some don't want us to do the inspection, or ones that we simply can't schedule. We can, or for other reasons, we can require owners to hire an engineer to do the inspection. And then also we have a comprehensive inspection requirement, which is a much more detailed inspection than a periodic. This can be required of high and significant hazard dams. This is a kind of a shift in standards at the federal level, and a recommendation that all states are starting to undertake is to do these more comprehensive inspections to look more in depth at the dam than just the visual and periodic inspections. And then lastly, again, probably the biggest shift is the compliance with the inspection result requirement, which is, again, in the future, we'll be able to compel owners to take action where in the past we simply couldn't do that.
If a dam owner is reluctant, worried about sort of bad news, how expensive this maintaining the dam might have going to be, and so they don't go ahead and get the inspection, do you have the ability to go ahead and inspect and then bill?
No, we don't have that authority. We're not actually allowed to enter private, or we're not allowed to enter property without owner permission. So if they do not give us permission to enter the property, we cannot enter. And so this is sort of our only other recourse, other than requiring them to hire an engineer to do an inspection to our standards and provide the report. Would be, we do have a provision in the statute that we can go and try to get an access order, and then get access to the property that way. I have not done that in my tenure, but that is something that we could do in those extreme cases.
Okay, thank you.
The phase 2 rules, which again are still underway, have a bunch of requirements around our permitting process, design, planning, construction requirements. They also have operation, maintenance, and technical inspection requirements. And one of the bigger things is requirements for emergency action plans for all significant and high hazard dams. There's going to be a requirement that they're updated every 2 years, so they're kept current and viable. And there's going to be some level of a requirement for regional testing and training. And then phase 2 also includes a bunch of engineering technical standards around the engineering topics associated with dam safety. And so that kind of brings me to the last part of my presentation here, and that is my charger came unplugged, excuse me. That is kind of our preliminary evaluation of S213. Not prepared to go through it line by line per se, but I do have these main points, and I do kind of apologize for the presentation appearance of these slides. I sort of wanted to get all of our ideas down and have that in case someone wanted to use this to evaluate the proposals in the bill.
Yeah, sure. Well, and we have only about 6-7 minutes. We'll get called to the floor.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if probably, rather than rushing, it's an important part of the conversation. So why don't we schedule time next week to come back and spend time looking at S213 implications and the department's thoughts about the bill's interest.
Yep. Yeah, if I can just comment at a very high level.
Yes,
it seems like the primary focus of the bill is two things. Number one is dam safety funding, and the other two is dam liability. From the in my opinion, a functional funding program is going to be critical to the future success of our dam regulation. With the dam safety rules coming in and the move from a passive to proactive regulation style, it's just highly likely that there's going to be more than some dam owners that are not going to be able to comply just due to financial limitations. Having some funding mechanism to help these owners is going to be critical to reducing dam safety risk and also avoiding the impasse that can otherwise occur where we require them to make an important safety change. They can't afford it. We take enforcement on them. They still can't afford it. And you sort of just end up in this do loop of really not getting to a satisfactory conclusion. And then the secondary item related to liability, I guess I would just say that I think in general, my program is really not in favor of the proposal that changes that seems to potentially subvert some of the liability from the owner to or reduce the liability the owner has for maintaining a quote unquote compliant dam. Liability is not really gained or lost. It's really only transferred. So who's it transferred to? Does that mean that downstream people who are impacted by a dam failure have less recourse, or does it mean that the state of the dam safety program now takes on that additional liability? And I mean, just think of like major dam issues that we've had in the country. Oroville Dam, for example, in California, it was a fully up to code, FERC regulated, huge state facility, largest earth embankment dam in the state that had that spillway issue. Should that dam owner have reduced liability? I don't know. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I guess I'll kind of leave it there. But those are kind of my high level thoughts.
Yeah, well, and so thanks for highlighting it. We've really not had any conversation other than Michael reading, walking briefly through that section of the bill to just highlight the language and allude to the fact that it's a major change, and so there's a lot more thinking and research that we need to do before pursuing it further. The other thing is, as we're getting towards wrapping up, is I just wanted to say again, in part because there's probably more people here than on the December 5th special meeting we had. To thank you and your staff for the work you did especially this year during those floods, because really there was a large portion of the state in crisis, many dams that were in jeopardy or at least in risky situations. And you folks were out in the field pretty much nonstop for days on end. So although most of us don't see you, we don't just want to say, while we do see you, thank you on behalf of lots of people that you really looked out for.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Great. Well, I see Senator White, you have a question.
Thank you, Chair Bray, and thank you, Mr. Green. And I would just reiterate from the chair, seriously, thank you, especially from any community that we have heard from that has a dam and they had issues post-flooding or during the flood, and the scary nature of that situation. Just want to say thank you, because that was, I think, traumatic is definitely a word that we've heard. And Senator Watson, I serve on government operations, so we've been hearing from those communities, the municipalities particularly this week. So my question to you relates to that, which is, what is the communication that you have with municipalities, and how do you work with them? Because it feels like one of the lessons that I'm learning from this flooding is that there hasn't necessarily been built-in communication with our municipalities. So if you could either correct the record for me on that and tell me how you work with, let's say, like the Montpeliers or the Londonderrys of the world, and if there are things that we can do to make that relationship stronger, that would be great, because it was a very scary situation for our municipalities who were concerned about a flood being much worse because of a dam, while also responding to active flooding. And if there was a way to prevent that kind of very scary, complex situation at all, I would be very excited to hear.
Yeah, I don't think that there's one complete solution, but I do think that, getting our rules in place and getting the emergency action plan requirement up and running, running regional training around that and awareness is going to have a huge, a positive impact. You know, again, we're a small staff. During the initial parts of the July 23 event, we were almost entirely wrapped up in our own flood control dams. It also, we learned a lot as well. We've sort of had maybe a too informal of a relationship with some of the immediately downstream communities of those facilities. And I think we're recognizing the need to have more formal relationships with them. So I think we're learning, and we're going to certainly be improved upon our communication downstream of our own facilities, and certainly our own dams. But I think, again, getting a viable emergency action plan up and running for every high and significant hazard dam, requiring the regular updates, having training that town officials can attend and really understand and be educated on what's available out there, and things like that are going to be hugely impactful. And fortunately, it's been something that we haven't really had the authority to put in place until now. So I think that's probably going to be have the biggest bang for the buck in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. One of the themes of, I think, through all our conversations so far related to 213 in the last week plus is the need for thinking long-term. Like we're talking about programs that are running basically in perpetuity. It's not like standing up something and finding one-time funding or 5-year funding even. We need a reliable funding mechanism that will operate for the next century, because the sense I think we've all had is climate change is only placing more demands on the landscape in terms of how water's arriving and moving, and we have to pick up our game in order to even sort of keep pace with it. So this is your area of expertise and work. Are you sensing that in your professional lifetime that the work is changing because of the nature of rain events and flood events?
Well, yeah, I think just a good antidote to that is at Waterbury Dam, we record the reservoir levels of record, and number 1 and number 2 were in the first 80 years, and 3 through 6 were in the last 12. So we are experiencing more flooding more frequently. We're operating that facility more often, and that's just sort of a simple antidote that just shows that things are changing. It does seem like we're dealing with more water more often.
Okay, all right. Well, on our end, the bell for the floor has started to ring, so I wanted to thank Ms. LaPierre, Mr. Dwayne, Mr. Green. Thanks for more education. Look forward to doing more work with you in the weeks ahead.